G'day, I'm Warwick Schiller and welcome back to the Principles of Training. The principle we're going to talk about today is called change one thing at a time. So this far along in the principles, some of the principles are starting to stack up and overlap now, and this principle of change one thing at a time kind of overlaps some of the other principles, probably namely the principle of they need to know the answer before you ask the question. And so in they need to know the answer before you ask the question, those, your training is so close together that when you ask them the next thing, they pretty much got it sorted out. So, a good example of change one thing at a time was, if you remember back in English class when you were a kid, they would do these word morph puzzles, and you would take one word and changing one letter at a time, you would turn that word into a completely different word. And let's say we were going to change the word head into tail. Okay, we start out with head, and then we'd go to heel, then you could go to hail, then you could go to hail, and then you could go to tail. But when we do that, we only change one letter at a time, and each new word is a word that makes sense. It's not gobbledygook. And so training horses, that's exactly what I think a lot of people who are successful with horses try to do, is they change one thing at a time, and the horse has to understand the new thing as well as it understood the old thing. You can't change things into gobbledygook. So a really good example of this principle would be the process that leads up to successfully riding a young horse for the first time. So initially I'd teach the young horse to do all sorts of groundwork. You get them where they can go, you can get them where they can stop, you can draw them, you can drive them. They are not concerned about things that might move around them, that sort of thing. Then when I start getting closer towards working on the saddling stage, I will work on sending that horse between me and the fence. Now, the horse knows how to send. I can lead him, I can use a feel in that halter and have him go where I want. I'm going to change one thing, and I'm going to change the fact that there is now a fence. The horse is now going between me and a fence. Once I get them good going between me and the fence, and they're comfortable about the fence, then I'm going to offer them a place to rest over by the fence. So this comes back to our principle of choose where you work, choose where you rest. I'm going to have them rest over by that fence. So once they can go between me and the fence quite well, and they can rest by the fence, I'm going to change one thing. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to climb up on the fence and be above them. But I'm only changing one thing. I'm above them, but where they're standing, they're quite comfortable being there. That part works fine. I'm only changing one thing here. Then I'll get to them where they can lead right up beside me on the fence. And once they're good, and I can rub on them, once they're good with that bit, then I might change one more thing and start doing some more motion up there, moving around, using my flag up there, that sort of thing. Now initially when I do that, I'm only going to have the flag or the movement on one side of the horse's body. After a little while, when they're good with that, I'm going to change it. I'm going to have it on the other side of the horse's body. I've just changed one more thing. So once I've got them good with things on both sides of their body, and I can put pressure on their back, now I'm going to start to add them together, and I'm going to actually sit me on their back. Once I can sit me on their back and they're good with that, then I'm probably going to start working on the saddling process, and it's a one thing at a time. First I'm going to work on having them good with the saddle pad from the left. Once they're good with it from the left, I'm going to change one thing. I'm going to work on it from the right. Then I'll work on putting the saddle on them from the left and the saddle on them from the right. And then separately from that, I'm going to work on having pressure around their girth, getting them to where they're good with pressure around their girth. Then what I'm going to do is if they're good with it, once they're good with the saddle pad, I'm going to change one thing and I'm going to add the saddle to the saddle pad. When they're good with that, then I'm going to do the girth up with the saddle and the saddle pad. So I'm only changing one thing at a time right there. Once they've got the saddle on, then I'm going to go back through the groundwork. They know all the groundwork. The groundwork is going to be the same groundwork they've done before, but I've changed one thing. I now have a saddle on them while they're doing the groundwork. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through that whole process with the saddle on until their groundwork is as good as it was before there was no saddle. So there's a couple of things that you really get out of this step-by-step, change one thing at a time process. And one of them is you don't overload your horse, you don't overface your horse. It's almost, once again, it's the horse needs to know the answer before you ask the question sort of thing. But the other thing, it tells you if your horse has been perfect up to this point, and then you add one more thing and there's a problem and they're not being good, you already have identified what the problem is. You don't go, oh, it could be one of 10 different things. You know what the problem is, and if you take a step backwards to the step before and it's perfect, you know that thing right there is the problem. And if you go back to the second episode that was called Don't Go to Bed Angry, and we talked about horses getting rabbits, okay? You can tell when your horse is starting to build rabbits, because when you add something new, they get worried, and if you take that new thing away and you go back to what was there before and it's perfect, you know that new thing is the problem. And I had a great example of this a few years ago. I started a black warm blood stallion, and he featured in some of my earlier YouTube videos, and once I got him good with all the groundwork and then I went to the saddling process, he was really, really weird about the saddle. Okay, he almost couldn't look two places at the same time, which means he was good with the groundwork when I was there, and once I got him saddled, he could be okay with the saddle over here, but when I'm over here and there's a stirrup over there and Warwick saddle, and he had a lot of trouble with that, and it took me about a month, a whole month, to get of saddling him probably 6 days a week and doing the groundwork with him to where he was as good with the saddle on doing the groundwork as he was before the saddle. So that saddle was a problem. Now some horses you can saddle them up, the first time you saddle them up, 5 minutes later they can do the groundwork as good as they did before. This horse, it took a month, okay? And it doesn't matter how long it takes, that's where your horse starts to build up those rabbits. And if this horse had about 13 rabbits having the saddle on, but let's say your horse, the saddle gives your horse 6 rabbits. And you go, oh no, he's fine, he seems fine, and then you hop on and ride him. You being on top of that saddle might take it to the 13 rabbit limit. Now your horse bucks and you wonder why the horse bucks. And so it took quite a while to get that sorted. And his first rides, especially his first ride outside, which is also on YouTube, he rode around, walked, trotted, canter, loose rein, had great forward gait, was relaxed. He was really, really cool. And he looked like he was easy, but I spent a month when I changed one thing, getting that thing as good as it was before that. And what was interesting was there was a jumping trainer I know, and she had a couple of horses that were by the same stallion this one was by. And when I started him, I also got to start a few others by the same stallion, and they were all the same about the saddle. You get through all the groundwork. They're a little weird anyway, but you got the groundwork really good. And then when you came to the saddling part, even though I went through a step-by-step process with the saddling, it took quite a while to get them good with the groundwork with the saddle as it was without the saddle. So that saddle was that one step that was going to set them off. And so I was talking to a jumping trainer, and she said, yeah, they're kind of weird. I had one a few years ago, and he could jump okay up to about 1.30 meters. And anything over 1.30 meters, he would just, out of the blue, he would just lose his mind. Like, sometimes if you got jumping over 1.30 meters, I'd be at a competition and he would just run off out of nowhere. One time he ran through a fence and through a crowd. Just out of nowhere that would happen. And I said to her, so how was he to saddle? And she said, oh, he was fine to saddle. I'm like, oh, okay. I said, so you could just drop the lead rope in the barn aisle and walk in the tack room, grab the saddle, come out and throw it on him. And she said, oh, no. You had to have 2 grooms hold him while you put the saddle on. And so that's what I'm talking about right there, is that one step. Okay, this horse, if you think about this horse, he was jumping 1.30 meters, so he'd been jumping quite a long time. And it was only, so if you think about this, the saddle giving him rabbits, as we called it in that episode called Don't Go to Bed Angry, if you think about that saddle giving him some worry, and he can hold on to a certain amount of worry, but once he gets over 1.30 m, that worry comes out and he loses his mind. And so if you can do things in a step-by-step fashion, and you can only change one thing at a time, you can tell what part doesn't work, and it enables you to stay on that part and keep working on it until it's really fixed. A couple more things I'm going to be doing with a young horse before I can ride them is I'm going to make sure they're really good at lateral flexion, at bending off the feel of that halter, and I also want to make sure they're good at stepping their hind leg over, disengaging behind, off pressure on their rib cage, soft pressure on the rib cage, and that's where I'm going to put my leg when I'm riding them. And so I want that really good on both sides. So by the time I get on them, they know how to do it. They know how to bend their head quite easily. They know how to move over off my leg. The only thing I'm changing is now I'm on them. Okay, they can do all that with the saddle on them. Now the only one thing I'm changing is I'm on them. And so that's how you can have a really smooth process from basically unstarted to being able to ride this horse around. So this whole principle of change one thing, it applies in a lot of places, but there's one place I think I can help a lot of people with this. Is I hear a lot of people say, I took my horse to a horse show and I had a lot of trouble at the horse show, you know, that my horse was crazy, whatever. And if you think about going to a horse show, you are changing a great number of things all at the same time. You're changing the location, you're changing the atmosphere, like there's a lot of atmosphere at a horse show. You're changing the number of horses there around there. You've got loudspeakers, you've got all sorts of stuff right there. And so what I'd suggest doing is, and this is almost the previous principle of the Donkey Kong principles when you go back to the start, is I would probably suggest if you think you can have trouble at a horse show, try to go to a friend's house. Take your horse over to a friend's house, somewhere where there's nothing going on, and maybe even start at the beginning, like just do some groundwork. Do whatever your starting point was. My starting point's groundwork. Whatever your starting point was, maybe go over there. And so the only thing you're going to change, the work you're going to do, the horse already knows, the only thing you're going to change is the location. And once you can do that quite well, so I wouldn't do that and then add more stuff. I'd get that to where you can go to a friend's house or a local arena where there's no one, when there's no one else there basically. You want to control the situation. Go there and get that bit good, even the groundwork, and then your riding. Just get to where your horse is as good at your friend's house or the local arena or wherever it is with nothing going on as your horse is at home. Then change one more thing. Maybe you could introduce a horse, and maybe you could just introduce a horse that someone holds on the ground while you ride around. You don't want to introduce a horse that's running around and probably adding any more anxiety to your horse than it's already got. You could have someone introduce a horse on the ground. Then you might be able to introduce 2 horses and then 3 horses, or then you might want to start, turning your stereo up real loud and having a loudspeaker going, all that sort of thing. And then, you're going to work up to it. So by the time you get to a horse show, it's so close to what you've been doing, it's not a big deal. So there's a lot of principles involved in this. There's the change one thing at a time, but there's also the Donkey Kong principle, and which is going back to the beginning all the time, and there is also the need to know the answer before you ask the question. If you remember earlier in this episode and in the episode of the need to know the answer before you ask the question, you're training, as you're training your horse, you're changing such small things that your horse almost doesn't realize that something's changed. It's just really close to it. And I get questions all the time on social media about different things, and I had someone ask me a question this morning that really has a lot to do with this. And she said she's riding a young horse and it trots around good, but when she goes to the canter, it kind of flings its head in the air and rushes off. And I said to her, how is your bigger trot? Like, what's it like when you go to a bigger trot? And because what I like to do with a young horse, think about this. When you're trotting along just like at a medium kind of a trot, okay, there's some energy, but there's not a lot of energy. And for your young horse to go off into a canter, you're gonna add probably quite a bit more energy there. And so instead of adding more energy and changing gait, which would be 2 things at the same time, what you could do is just ask for a bigger trot. And the bigger trot tells me a lot of stuff, and this comes back to the need to know the answer before you ask the question. But that bigger trot tells me a lot. If I can go to a bigger trot and they go up easily into that bigger trot, So that's good, they go easily into it. Then I'm just going to kind of relax my seat and slow it down. And if my horse stays at that bigger trot or that bigger trot escalates, it's probably telling me that if this horse goes off into a canter, he's going to kind of run off. If I have a hard time getting up to that bigger trot and my horse kind of pins his ears and swishes his tail, he's telling me if I ask him to canter, he's probably going to buck and say no. And so you'd really like to just get to where you could trot along, ease up into a bigger trot and ease back down in that smaller trot quite easily. So you're only changing one thing at a time, and that's the amount of energy you have. Once your horse can handle going from low energy to high energy to low energy, then you could probably ask them to canter, and they'll probably just roll off into that canter quite easily. And so the girl that I'd messaged, it was actually last night, I said, how's the bigger trot? How's your horse going into the bigger trot? She says, well, I don't really know. I'll go and check it out. And so she got back to me this morning and she said, oh, I tried the bigger trot last night and he does exactly the same thing going into the bigger trot as he does going into the canter. And so it's not a canter problem. It's the amount of energy that horse is having. And so that horse is having some problems adding energy. So we don't need to add energy and change a gait, which would be changing two things at the same time. So you might notice I've been riding Bundy here in a hackamore. Actually, when I first started riding Bundy, I rode him in just a rope halter, and then I went to a snaffle, and then eventually I went to this hackamore here. But when I made the transition from the rope halter to the snaffle, the only thing I changed was the snaffle. And so what I didn't do was the first day I put a snaffle on it and go, okay, now what we're going to do is teach you something completely different than what we've taught you before. We're not going to add anything else. I didn't change two things at once. I went from like I said, from the rope halter to the snaffle. And when I did that, I would have done the Donkey Kong principle as well. I would have went back to the beginning. Okay, I would have went back to the first time I put the snaffle on him. No, I did this on the ground before I got on him. But I would have said, okay, so can you laterally flex here in this snaffle? And by the time I got to the snaffle, just like with this right here, he laterally flexes off the slack coming out of the rein. I'm not actually pulling on him. And so when I went to the snaffle, he was operating off the feel of this rein. And so he wasn't actually operating off me pulling on his mouth. And so then the same thing when I went to the hackamore, but it probably wasn't as big a change going to the hackamore because he'd already been ridden the rope halter. But, so when you change tack or things like that, try to make sure you don't change a lot of things at once. And with Bundy, when I went from the rope halter to the snaffle, that was just progression, okay? But sometimes you are actually looking for problems. And so let's say your horse, he appears to be lacking some weight, or he appears to be, there's something about his health maybe you want to change with food. What you wouldn't do is go, okay, we're going to throw out what we had and we're going to feed him 3 scoops of this and 2 scoops of that and give him a whole lot of new stuff, and all of a sudden he looks great. But you do not know which one worked. And I actually have a horse trainer friend of mine who found this out the hard way for himself a number of years ago. I was at a horse show and it was a hot summer day and I was having a beer and I said, you want a beer? And he goes, oh, I can't. And I said, why not? And he says, oh, I'm allergic to, I think it was yeast. He said, I went to a doctor and they did a test on me and I'm allergic to yeast, and so I can't have beer anymore. And so this poor guy, he didn't drink beer for about 4 years, and he said, I love to have a cold beer on a hot day. And then here last year I saw him at a show and he was drinking a beer, and I said, what happened? And he said, well, what I did was, when the doctor said you're allergic to yeast, I cut out everything that had yeast in it. I didn't cut them out one at a time and see which one worked. Well, it turns out, so he said, I went back and I said, well, I'm going to start slowly adding yeasty things in and see which one it is, and it turns out it wasn't beer. So I love a cold beer on a hot day, and this guy had deprived himself of a cold beer on a hot day for 5 years because he had changed too many things at once. If he changed one thing at a time, he would have figured out it wasn't the yeast in the beer that was affecting him. And it's a lot the same as I was talking about a minute ago with your feeding, or let's say you've got like a apparent lameness issue or whatever, or maybe a bucking under saddle issue or whatever. Some people will go, okay, I'm going to get the saddle fitter out, and I'm going to get the body worker out, and I'm going to get the farrier out and the vet out, and I'm going to do all this thing the same day. And you might not know actually what the problem was. So, you'd probably start and change one thing at a time. Have the body worker work on the horse, and if that works, good. Then you might not have to go any further. But if that doesn't work, okay, and then you would just, it's just a process of ruling things out. And so you can do that with your feeding, you can do that with, say, lameness or behavioral issues. But you're also going to do it with your training, you know, like as you're adding new movements to your horse. You know, let's say a leg yield. Okay, if your horse is going to do a leg yield, you're going along, you do a leg yield. He's just moving off. Say it was a leg yield from right to left. He's just moving off your right leg. But if you then say you went to do a haunches in on that right side, your horse has to get off your left leg, but he also you have to be able to hold him up with your right leg here too. And so what you wouldn't do is go, and that's why you don't teach a haunches in before you teach a leg yield, because you've got to have, you know, too many things operating at once. And like I said, once again, this principle is so closely aligned with they need to know the answer before you ask the question. And as I said earlier, this far along in the principles of training, they're all kind of starting to overlap just a little bit, but you know, they also stand alone too. So hopefully that gives you an understanding of the principle of change one thing at a time and how it can help you and your horse. So don't forget to join us next time and we'll look at another principle of training.